are in week 5 of a 6-week series called Valleys, where we are talking about how you and I walk with God through suffering and pain. And today, as he mentioned, we're going to talk about something that we call hope. And as we begin this, I want to just make a distinction between the hope that is described in the Bible and the hope that we typically think of in our culture, because they are radically different things. For most of us, when we hear the word hope, hope is something that's associated with a feeling or an idea or a way of relating to circumstances that is very contradictory to the hope that we hear about in the Bible. In fact, in our culture, hope has actually come to mean something that is the opposite of what the biblical idea of hope really is. The biblical idea of hope is something that is based on security. Hope is something that is associated with assurance. It's associated with confidence. In our culture, hope is associated with just the opposite of that, right? A lack of confidence or a lack of assurance or lack of knowing what's going to happen next. The way that we use hope is usually in moments in which we know that things are going to go a particular way, but we're sort of wishing they wouldn't. You know what I'm talking about? Like you don't study for a test, and then you take the test, and as you're walking out, you say, I really hope that I did good on that, right? But you know how much you studied, you know how you did. The hope is just sort of like rubbing the genie bottle and saying, God, would you please suddenly make the numbers change on the paper miraculously, right? That's how we think of hope, right? Or guys, when you're going to ask somebody out on a date and you approach that person, there's a part of you that all the evidence says she's going to say no, but you're like, I hope she says yes, right? The chances are no, but I'm just hoping. It's like this wish that maybe she'll say yes, right? Or you do something really stupid at work, and you think to yourself, I hope this doesn't get me fired, right? That usually means you're going to get fired, right? I mean, if you're hoping you're not going to get fired, that's usually because that's what's coming next for you, right? You know what I'm talking about? That's how we use hope. When you and I use the word hope, it usually means everything predicts that we're going one direction. Everything says we're headed down this road. But if there's a chance, right? If there's just a chance, then I want to just throw this out there. And that's what we think of when we say hope. I hope I get the job. I hope I win the lottery. I hope whatever. And it means there's probably not a good chance of it, but we're wishing, right? That's the exact opposite of the biblical idea of hope. The biblical idea of hope is something that's built on the opposite principle. Let me just give you an example of this. A couple of summers ago, I decided I needed some time away, and so one of the things that I did is I took my bike, actually my mountain bike and my road bike, and I threw them in my truck, and I decided to head west and go do some epic rides, some bike rides that were epic, which in my world, epic bike ride means really painful, lots of suffering, and lots of climbing, and that's a sick individual that chooses that for recreation. But that's what I was doing. So I headed off west, and one of the rides that I chose to do was a ride called Hurricane Ridge that's in Olympic National Park. Has anybody ever heard of Hurricane Ridge before? You've been there? There's like a few of you. Okay. So Hurricane Ridge, I got a picture that I did not take. But here's a picture of Hurricane Ridge. This is the road kind of climbing up there. I know that whoever took this picture was not on a bike when they took this picture, because it's impossible to breathe at this altitude and after doing what you're doing. So Hurricane Ridge, here's the ride. It starts in Port Angeles. How many of you guys know Port Angeles? You know about where that is? Port Angeles at the altitude of a whopping 97 feet. That's the altitude of Port Angeles. The top of Hurricane Ridge, 18 miles later, is 5,200 feet. So you go from 97 to 5,200 in 18 miles, and the thing never lets up. Never lets up. In fact, you actually climb 5,300 to get to 5,200 because they just thought they'd mess with you. That's the sort of thing that it is, right? In fact, this was just nonstop, not even moderate suffering. This is just suffering for 2 straight hours. And I did a lot of cultural hoping. There was a lot of wishing that I was doing while I was riding, and it had to do with when I was shifting my bike, I was downshifting to find more gears, and there was this one point where I knew I was at the bottom, but I just kept hitting the shifter thinking, there's got to be one more. God, please, just wish, I hope there's another gear. And there wasn't. And I'm just grinding it out, doing this climb. And as I think back to that, there's a sort of interesting thing that goes through my mind. I realized this even this week as I was thinking about 18 grueling miles of non-stop climbing. It is painful in the first 3 miles. And I was thinking about this week, and I realized at any point in the middle of my suffering, I could have just turned and gone back down with gravity, and it would have been fun, and I would have been in my car, and I'd have been eating lunch somewhere, right? So I just kept going. And there's lots of questions you think about when you just keep going, and when you think about how easy it would be in the middle of miserable suffering to just turn around and be out of it. There's questions you ask. The first question you ask about someone like me is, why? Like, why would you keep going, right? I can't answer that for you. That requires therapy and probably some things that I don't want to talk about in front of people, right? Because there's something sick about an individual who this is their idea of fun. In fact, Hurricane Ridge is on a list. The top 100 hardest rides in North America to do. The fact that there's a list means there's other sick people like me who are checking it off, right? Oh, I'm at like 97. Give me another sick ride to do, right? So I don't know why I do this. I just do it. But here's what I do know. I do know how I do it. How do I keep going? How do I keep from just turning around and heading back the other direction? The answer is this. It's really simple. The how is that I simply keep looking forward. The how is that I already knew when I started it that this was an 18-mile ride, that I was going to climb to 5,200 feet. I knew how difficult it would be, and I knew that eventually there was this reward at the end. There was just lots of climbing and lots of looking ahead. I just kept my eyes on the horizon. I kept my eyes on the future. I kept my focus on what was to come, not what was happening in the moment. That illustration, that picture, I think, is a better place for us to begin to understand the concept of biblical hope than the cultural hope that most of us live our lives with. It's this idea of looking forward, this idea of looking ahead. It's the idea of being in a situation, but looking ahead to what is in front of us, not the moment that we happen to be in the moment. Real hope is set in the future, but it is rooted in reality. It is rooted in what's happening around us. It is not guessing about what might happen next. It is knowing what will happen next. That is the real hope of Scripture. Real hope is based on what is true, not what might be true, not on what we wish will be true, not on what we kind of guess could be there, but it's based on a reality. So hope is this life-changing certainty about your future. That's what biblical hope is. Biblical hope is this sense of being certain about what's next in such a significant way that it influences where we are in the moment. This is incredibly good news for humanity, and here's why. As human beings, we are perpetually hope-based beings, and it is undeniable. We as human beings, one of the distinctives that makes us people is that we look to the future. We live in the future, and we live our lives based on what we know about that future. We're influenced about what we know, what comes next. That's one of the things that makes us uniquely human. We are hope-based creatures. Here's an example of this. April 15th is coming up. Yeah, some of you know what I'm talking about, right? April 15th is associated with one filthy word, right? Taxes, right? Taxes. April 15th is coming. Check this out. Some of you in the room are going to get a check. And some of you in the room are going to write a check. Right? Those are basically the two options when it comes to taxes, right? You're either going to write a check or you're going to get a check. And the difference is unbelievable on how you feel about that today. You think about this just for a second. Those of you that are going to get a check, think about how that's already influencing you. The people that I know, it drives me crazy. You know what group I fall in right now. The people that are getting a check, first of all, they're walking around like they're getting some gift from the government. And I want to burst their bubble constantly and say, you realize that's your money they're giving back to you. That was your money. They're just giving it back to you. Like, it doesn't make any sense. But still, I guess I just did do that. I did burst your bubble. But that being said, people that are getting a check, they walk around and they're like, oh yeah, I feel pretty good right now. You know, my finances are good and I feel good about decisions that I'm making and I'm starting to wonder about various purchases or what I could do with my life with all of this money that I'm getting. You know, I've got so much money because of, I see these people, right? They walk around, there's this confidence. And then there's those of us that are writing a check and we're walking around thinking, how many days straight can I eat beans and rice? Right? In fact, this is what I've noticed. If you're getting a check, do you know when you do your taxes? January, right? If you're writing a check, you do your taxes on April 14th, right? Like you're like waiting the longest, and every bill that comes in, every expense, everything that happens, you wait against, oh man, that's another thing, right? That's another hit, right? When you're getting a check, you're like, yeah, who cares? Bills, yeah, send them, a Vista, rack up I don't care, right? Mess with my meter. That's kind of how you live when you're that way, right? So if you look at this and you think about this, your present is determined by a future that you're certain of. If you're writing a check, you live a certain way. If you're receiving a check, you live a certain way. That's what it looks like to be human. That's one of the things, I think we all understand this. We are influenced in the present by what we know about the future. Now let's take this to another level. We are all in this room together, and believe it or not, with all of our differences, we essentially are living the same sort of life. We live in the same kind of culture. We have the same sort of challenges. Most of us fit in the same sort of economic window. I mean, generally speaking, we are all walking through very similar things. And yet in this room, even in this room, and especially outside of this room, there are people that are walking with two very different perspectives around their future. One perspective, and you may have this and you may be here, and maybe you just know somebody that has this perspective, but one perspective says this: regarding the future, I'm really uncertain about this universe that we live in. It's chaotic. It seems disorganized and random at times. And yeah, I hear stories about a God who maybe was a part of this creation, but at times I just wonder whether or not that God exists, and if that God does exist, does he really care about us? I'm not sure I can put any trust in any sort of belief system around the universe and creation and God and all these different things. Therefore, I just kind of feel that when my lungs stop pumping air and my heart stops pumping blood, that my life will come to an end and it'll just sort of be over. That'll just sort of be it. So there are people that sort of feel that way, right? I don't believe in God. I just kind of believe when it's over, it's over. It's done. Then there's another person. Think of another person who says, man, I look at this universe with all of its intricacies and the beauty, and I see the hand of God. I see the hand of God moving throughout creation. And I hear this story that has been passed on through generations of a God who loves and cares and extends compassion and mercy. And I know that someday in my future, when my lungs stop breathing and my heart stops pumping blood, that there is a life that goes beyond this, and that this God who has created things will eventually redeem and renew and restore all of the brokenness, and he will include me in that. Two different people living in the same culture, the same environment. Do you think those two people will live differently? Undoubtedly, right? Undoubtedly, we will live our lives differently based on what we believe about our future. We will live differently based on what we understand to be true in the days ahead of us, not just in daily life, but especially in suffering. Think about navigating suffering from either of those two perspectives, and you begin to realize how important what we believe about our future becomes in the moment of crisis that we walk through, in the valleys that we find ourselves moving through. It absolutely makes a difference. We are hope-based creatures, and what we believe about the future will either darken our present circumstance and weaken our lives, or it will enlighten our present circumstance and give strength to our lives. There's this idea I just want to mull around with you this morning, and it's this. If you're taking notes, something to think about. If you're not, something to memorize. What you and I believe about our future will impact how we live in our present. What we believe intellectually about our future will absolutely influence how we live in our present. It will absolutely make a difference. It will make a difference in how we're functioning. Everything we're doing today, conscious or subconscious, is based on what we believe about our future. So I want to unpack this. I want to look at something with you and give you an example of this. Lamentations chapter 3. Lamentations is a really interesting book in the Old Testament. It comes later in the life of Israel, and I want to share a few verses from the middle of chapter 3. It says this. Verse 20, the writer says, my soul continually remembers it. And he's talking about a tragedy, and I'll get to that in a minute. My soul continually remembers it and is bowed down within me. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him. So the writer of Lamentations is obviously lamenting. Doesn't take a scholar to figure that one out, right? It's a lament, right? He's lamenting. He's lamenting the loss of the city of Jerusalem. Let me just explain what's happening here. It's about 587 BC. The Babylonian Empire has conquered the nation of Israel. And in 587, they've laid siege to the city of Jerusalem, and now they've finally taken it down. The walls are destroyed. The temple is destroyed. all of the wealth is sucked out of the city of Jerusalem. Every precious stone, every bit of precious material that was in the temple was even melted out of the temple and taken. It was carried off to the great city of Babylon. The temple is destroyed. The people are carted off. Anyone that had an education or any sort of worth in society, they were brought to Babylon, and what was left was a remnant of people who were living in poverty and barely surviving. The city of Jerusalem is a wreck. It's gone. It's laid waste. And that's what the writer is writing about. Everything that seemed to matter in life is now gone. Everything that seemed to matter has been taken. And he says, my soul continually remembers. He's saying, listen, this is something that I just can't seem to get over. My soul is bowed down within me. He continually remembers it. Like those things that happen that you just never get over, which all of us have experienced. There's things that for all of us we've walked through, and it doesn't matter how far away we get from that event, there are still questions that don't get answered. There are still tensions that don't get resolved. That's what he's talking about. I still remember, I just can't seem to get over this thing. Maybe I'll forget for a few minutes, but then in the middle of my distraction, somebody will say something, somebody will do something, or when I finally get out of my busyness, I'll remember, and all the pain and the heartache and the emotions, it just sort of creeps back in. That's what he's saying. I remember continually. There are things that you and I just don't get over. There are things that we don't get past, and they are there. That is a real and legitimate feeling, and he is identifying with us in this, and we are identifying with him in this. And he says, my soul is bowed down. It's this sort of physical picture of him just bowing, a person bowing before something. He's bowing before his suffering. He realizes, my life is being submitted to this pain and this heartache. I realize, this thing is the big thing in my life. Why? Why is he so depressed? Well, think about the city of Jerusalem for these people. The city of Jerusalem for the Jewish people was this symbol. For 400 years, they had lived up until this point with relative peace in the city of Jerusalem. The city of Jerusalem was this place of security. It was a place of joy. It was even a place of identity for the people of Israel. Jerusalem was this beautiful, strong, fortified city. And when the Jews began to live in that region, they constructed this massive temple. The temple was one of the greatest wonders of the world at the time. And that temple was a statement to all of the surrounding nations that God was present with these people. And so here was this strong city, and God's presence was known. And for 400 years, they are blessed and life is good, and their identity is caught up in this city. You know how you meet somebody and they're so proud of their hometown, they just gush about the place they came from? That's what it was like to be from Jerusalem. If you lived in Jerusalem, Jerusalem was your identity. We are the Hebrews who live in this great city of God. And now it's been taken. Does that happen to us? The things that we've leaned on for identity, the things in our culture that we have grasped for to find some sense of identity, some sense of being, the roles that we've attempted to play, the pursuits that we've chased trying to find purpose, do those things get stripped from us? Absolutely. Do you ever lose your joy because the thing that brought you joy is suddenly gone? Do you ever find yourself not having peace because what you thought would bring peace didn't bring peace? Have you ever had things stripped away from you that you thought you could rely on and now you realize you can't? That's what he's experiencing. Jerusalem being taken, it's his identity, it's his security, it's his peace, it's his joy, it's his everything. But then as he continues, he says something unbelievably insightful. Verse 21, he says, but I call this to mind. It's about what he's thinking. He says, I call this to mind, and I have hope. This is a huge sentence in this passage. This is so critical, and it's so important. I want you to catch a couple things. First of all, I want you to see that the writer has hope in the middle of losing everything. In the middle of trial, in the middle of crisis, in the middle of the madness and the sadness, this guy somehow has hope in the middle of all of this. And this Hebrew word hope that he uses, it carries all the nuance of what I described in that picture earlier. It is this idea of expecting a new tomorrow. It's this idea of knowing that there is something in our future that is better than today. It is this idea that whatever is happening around me does not define me, but there is something good on the road ahead. It is this hope that gets us through. And he says, I have this. In the middle of this madness, in the middle of my joy and peace and security, all this stuff being stripped from me, somehow I have this hope about me, right? Which brings us to the question of how. How does he have this hope? And he completely reinforces what we were talking about a moment ago. This hope is made possible because he calls this to mind. He says, I call this to mind. Hope is dependent on something that is happening in our minds. It's about how we think. It's about what we think about. That's what he's saying. I call this to mind. I have this hope because of something that I'm thinking about, something that's going on inside of my mind. Hope is not because of my circumstances. Hope isn't because things are looking up. Hope isn't because life's getting a little bit easier these days. Hope is something that the writer calls to mind. And what does the writer call to mind? Verse 22. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Now, there's something that's happening in the writer's mind as he's thinking about this that I think is beautiful, and it's so good for us to see. He's actually addressing something that has been a part of humanity's thinking through every generation. In fact, it's something that we see very dominant in primitive cultures that pre-existed this moment in Lamentations, but it's also something primitive that I see crop up in people's thinking when they're walking through valleys. Look at what he says here. He says, He's saying the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. And when he says this, he's separating the steadfast love of God from the present affliction that is around him. He's saying, listen, this thing, even though I've just lost everything, even though the city is gone, the wealth is gone, my security, my peace, my joy, it's been taken. He says, this moment that I find myself in, it is not a reflection of God's love for me. Do you realize how revolutionary this is? I mean, this was revolutionary then. In Lamentations, this was brand new thinking for most of the world's populations, but I really believe this is still brand new thinking for us, right? Because we assume, like when things go bad for us, when suddenly the circumstances turn, there's this subtle subconscious thing that most of us in the room will do, that when the circumstances get bad and life throws a hiccup to us or we walk through valleys, some of the first reaction that many human beings have even today is, well, then God must be upset with me, or what did I do to deserve this, or God, how can I change my circumstances? What do I need to do to change how you feel about me? Or if we don't go there, we just sort of begin to distance ourselves from God and assume that God is ambivalent, that God doesn't care. We sort of get a deist perspective of the universe and think that God is just sort of off in the distance watching us suffer and not really caring about us. But the writer of Lamentation, he presents something different. He says, listen, in fact, you need to understand that this is a person who is writing, and in the very scriptures that God has given us to reveal his heart towards us, we have somebody saying, God is not my circumstances. His feelings are not defined by what's happening around me. Despite these circumstances, in fact, God's love never ceases. Despite this loss, his mercies never come to an end. In fact, he says that the mercies of God are new every morning. What does that mean? What's the first thing that you think about when you wake up in the morning? For most of us, I think the first and most natural things that flood our mind when the alarm goes off, maybe the moment after the alarm goes off, because the moment the alarm goes off, in that moment we think and say things that I can't say in church, right? Like the alarm goes off and you're like, yeah, no. But in the moment that follows that, right, after you've like hit snooze, or you've turned the alarm off and you're still laying there in bed, the thoughts that flood our mind, the most natural things that come to mind, for those of us that have responsibilities in life, let me qualify this, they do not produce praise or comfort, do they? Like when you're laying in bed, the alarm goes off and your day's getting ready to start. For most people, what happens next does not produce like, oh God, you are so good. Thanks for this morning, you know. Man, I just love getting up out of bed. It's great, right? I mean, more often than not, like the first thing that comes to mind, it's like the burdens that we have, right? The stuff we have to do. for me, I often grab my calendar and I refresh my memory of what I have coming ahead of me. And I begin to think through my day, and suddenly there's all this different stuff that's happening. I've also noticed this. Isn't it amazing how smart you are the day after you made a stupid decision? You ever notice that? Sometimes you wake up in the morning. How many of you ever woken up and you really regret something you did the day before? I'm just talking in general sense, not too specific here. But you make a decision, you wake up and you're like, how do I see things so clearly today? And yesterday I didn't. And so now you're faced with cleaning up yesterday's messes, dealing with relationship conflicts, dealing with all the heartaches, the burdens, the different things that you have just to do in your day. Most of us begin our days thinking about those sort of things. Most of us start our days with this sense of all that we have to do, and underlying all of that, usually for most of us, is also a sense of, how in the world am I going to get all of this done? How can I do it? How can I take it all on? And if we're not careful, those few groggy moments, those heavy minutes, those can define our entire day if we're not careful. The author of Lamentations, he's sort of recognizing this reality that when the sun breaks and the day begins and those things start to come upon us, we go get our coffee, which just makes us think about those things even faster, right? When that happens, he's saying in the middle of this, God will show up every morning and he will give you enough new mercy to get you through the day. For every one of those days that we've had an end of one of those days. We've crawled into bed and we've realized we made it. That's just with the surface stuff of life. Those of you that are walking through tragedy or have walked through tragedy, you've had moments when you've woken up and the burden is so heavy and you think, how am I going to get through this day? And what you've experienced and what you will continue to experience is that God will give you enough mercy to get you through that day. And you'll wonder how you'll get through the next one. And what you will see is that his mercies are new every morning. And he will give to you enough mercy for the day so that you can get through. That's what the author is acknowledging. He's saying, I know this thing is so big. I wake up and it's like it's never going to go away. But God's getting me through. And then he says something you would never expect him to say. Verse 23, he says, great is your faithfulness. He's seeing this. He's like, God, look at the way you're getting me through this. Great is your faithfulness. And then he says, the Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore, I will hope in him. I'm not wishing in him. I don't have anxious hopes about the future with him. I hope with this solid sort of hope in him. He's saying, listen, the Lord is my portion. Like, all this stuff's been taken. All these things that culture said should have been my portion, all of those things are now gone. But the Lord is my portion. The Lord is what I'm going to feast on. The Lord is what I'm going to have. It is my piece of the pie of this life. The Lord is my portion. He recognizes this. And on the other side of the cross, for you and I, in this season of human history, on this side of the cross in history, it should be even more true of us that we understand the joy and we understand the peace and we understand the life that comes because of what happened on the cross, that we understand that Jesus is our portion, that God's faithfulness is great, that he is actually what we need, that he is the hope that gets us through, that our hope can actually be found in him. In fact, what's fascinating, through this series on suffering, I've just been reading book after book after book, and one of the things that I've seen over and over is that throughout history, there have been writers outside of the community of Christ who have reflected on Christians and their ability to navigate the darkest of circumstances of life. And history is filled with people who have observed the Christian community, people like us from a distance, and they have said over and over again, how is it possible that these people navigate the darkest, most dire circumstances the way that they do? They navigate life with a hope that is not seen or present in anyone else in humanity. How is it possible? It's possible because of the cross of Jesus Christ. It's possible because of the hope that we have in him. It's possible because God's greatest statement of love for us came amidst suffering. It's possible for us to navigate suffering because the defining moment of God's love is a love that is communicated amidst the suffering of the cross of Jesus Christ. That's how it's made possible. Jesus didn't lavish us with gifts. That's not how we experienced this from God. It isn't God's love being expressed because we got everything we ever wanted. It's expressed in our being covered with the blood of Jesus Christ. That's what gives us this hope. And it is this definitive, radical statement that the afflictions of life and the pain and the suffering and the heartache and the loss does not define God's love for us. The cross makes a statement that says, no matter what you are going through, don't ever look at your circumstances. Don't ever look at the valley and think that that is how I feel about you. Look at the cross. That's how I feel about you. That's what defines my love for you. That is what you can hold on to. The cross of Jesus reveals to us a God who says, I want you in the darkest of life's moments to have something that you can reach to and hold on to that doesn't slip out of your hands like all of the things that culture tells you to reach to. I don't want you to grasp for shifting sands. I want you to have something that you can take hold of that won't fail you, that won't leave you. And the only thing that does that is the gospel of Jesus Christ. What he has done for us and what that means for our future. That is what we lay hold of. The story of Jesus over and over again, you know what it reveals to us? This is not all there is. When I say that, I mean it generally. I mean it, this is not all there is. This right here, this moment, this sliver in history, this is not all there is. But I also mean it very specifically. The cross of Jesus says to whatever trial we're walking through, this is not all that there is. The greatest promise of God, it is not a pleasure-filled, pain-free existence. The greatest promise of God is a future and a hope, a life that goes beyond this moment, a life that goes beyond this life. This week I've been quoting one of my favorite theologians, the great Frank Sinatra, who said, the best is yet to come, and babe, won't that be fine? All week this week, I've just been thinking, isn't that the story of the gospel? The best is yet to come, and isn't it going to be good? Isn't it going to be good? I'll wrap up with this. There's this scene, the night that Jesus is betrayed by Judas, right before the crucifixion. There's this scene where Jesus is, it's like a parent who's leaving his kids alone for the first time. For Jesus, he's been teaching the disciples for 3.5 years. He's been telling them, this is what life's about. This is what I'm all about. This is who I am. This is the promise you have of a future. And then in this final conversation, it's like Jesus is like, okay, you guys know, like, don't open the door for strangers. Don't answer the phone and tell people that we're not here. You know, he's doing that sort of thing, right? He's like just wrapping things up. And in John chapter 14, just sort of easing these disciples as they move into a new season and as Jesus is getting ready to depart. They don't know he's leaving. He knows he's leaving. He says these words in verse 1 of John 14. He says, let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. By the way, let me just back up to that. Believe in God. Think about this. He says, let not your hearts be troubled. You're going to be in circumstances in the days ahead. You're going to feel things because of what's happening around you. Don't let that determine how you feel in your heart. Don't let your heart be swayed by the circumstances around you. Believe in God. Think a particular way about God, and then Jesus makes a beautiful claim to deity, and also in me. Believe these things about God. Believe these things about me. And then he says, in my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again, and I will take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. He is talking about the future. And then in verse 4, he says, and you know the way to where I am going. And Jesus is clear. I go to prepare a place for you, that where I am, you may also be. And in that single sentence, he says, this is not all that there is. There is more to life than what you think there is. There is something beyond the moment that you're in. There is a story that is bigger than you ever imagined, and that is where your hope is found. It is in a future that has been secured and promised because of what Jesus Christ has done for you on the cross. Maybe you say, well, man, I would love to have a hope that is that sure and that confident. How is that possible? That's a great question. And if you were in that room with those 12 individuals that stood by Jesus, you would not have been alone asking that, because Thomas essentially says the same thing. Thomas is standing there. He's like, wait a second, Jesus, we actually don't know where you're going, and we don't know how to get there. In verse 5, Thomas says, Lord, we do not where you are going. Like, this is really cool. Like, you want us to have hope, but we don't know where you're going. How can we know the way? And Jesus said to him, I am the way and the truth and the life. And no one comes to the Father, no one knows the Father except through me. And the message of the Bible is clear, and it has been proven true for centuries. The hope that gets us through, the hope that we can hold on to, is a hope that is found when you and I say yes to Jesus. He's the way. He's the truth. He is the life. And I don't know about you, but with the ups and downs and the valleys and the peaks of my life, I need a way that I can lean on. And I need a truth that I can hold on to that isn't changing constantly and leaving me and shifting. And I'm convinced that I'm not the only one in this room right now that desires a life that is defined by more than what's happening in this moment. Which is why I say yes to Jesus. Because he's the way, and he's the truth, and he's the life, and he's what gives me hope in this life. So it kind of leaves us with a couple of questions. And the first one I think is really simple, and it's just this. Have you said yes to Jesus? Have you said yes in a way that you're believing things about your future that are different? Have you said yes to Jesus? Have you said yes to him being your way? Have you said yes to him being your truth? And have you said yes to him being your life? Have you just said, yeah, man, I've been exploring this, and I'm going to cross that line. I'm going to say yes to Jesus being those things for me. Until you say yes to Jesus, your hope will only ever amount to wishing. But when you do, you will stand strong in circumstances. And you'll be one of those people that people look at and say, I don't know how, I don't know how they get through. But that person's responding to life differently than I ever imagined I could. The second question I'll leave you with is this. Whatever valley you are walking through, whatever tragedy you have walked through, whatever thing that's in your past or in your present that's just owning you right now, that's keeping you from having joy and peace and life, have you allowed the perspective that Jesus brings to this to transform that moment? Have you invited Jesus to give you that kind of hope? Have you asked him and said, Lord, I believe in you, but I don't know that I'm seeing this with eternity in view. Would you help me do that? I'm going to ask you to stand with me. We're going to close by worshiping together and singing about this hope. And whether it's a decision to say yes to Jesus or an invitation for him to allow you to see how he sees, I want to take this time and allow him to transform all of our perspective of the valleys that we're walking through. So let's worship together. His name is higher. His name is greater. His word is unfailing. His promise is unchanging. May you be men and women who find your hope in that God. And may you be as strong and as stable and as filled with love and joy and peace as the God in whom you put your trust.